We're going to take a trip together, you and I. For a minute, I want you to close your eyes and concentrate. Imagine something with me. Imagine yourself flying in an aeroplane. You've probably been on a modern jet at some point, so imagine that, but much, much narrower as you thunder through the night. You can just about squeeze past another person in the body of this aircraft, and the roof is so low that you have to stoop to walk around, and there are almost no windows. The skin of the aircraft, its metal frame and ribs, are showing, but there's no soft furnishings or any nods to aesthetics in here. Not that it matters, because it's pitch black. It's so dark that, at first anyway, you can't see your hand in front of your face. As your eyes adjust, you realise that you can see just, but the world is grey and black and white and indistinct. The aircraft is not flying smoothly like a jet. Every part of it is vibrating, bouncing, rocking, swaying and flexing. It's like something that's alive. It's like a small boat in a hurricane. But all that is secondary to the noise. It's so loud in here that even shouted commands can't be heard. The only way to talk is using the intercom, connected to you by a small, thin, badly insulated wire that leads from your mask to the aircraft. You know with a terrifying certainty that if this wire breaks, or if the system fails, or if it's shot out, you are absolutely cut off, on your own, in the dark, relying on oxygen in your mask to breathe tens of thousands of feet off the ground, with nothing but the howling void between you and death. You could die here and no one would know. It's all on a wire a fraction of an inch thick, put there by a factory worker who's worked 6 12-hour shifts back to back and serviced by ground crew working in the open in freezing conditions day after day without a break on bad pay. It is beyond freezing in here in the rear turret. You scan the sky for shapes that shouldn't be there. If that intercom fails and you see a shark grey outline of a fighter slide into view, you won't be able to warn anyone, and you'll all die in a hail of cannon fire. It's so cold that to remove a glove to clear a stoppage or try and rotate the guns manually will mean freezing burns and frostbite. And all of this will go on for hour after hour after hour after hour as the engines drone away. You must ignore the cold, the fear, the engine drone, the urge to sleep, and watch the inky dark, waiting for something to materialise and kill you and your crew. It could be your imagination. That could be a cloud. Or it could be streaking death. If you hesitate, everyone dies. If you miss, everyone dies. You know that these planes crash. Not in an abstract kind of a way, but regularly. You've seen it. One a day into Tampa Bay, as they said back at training. Flying in 1943 is dangerous. During training you will have seen those crashes, seen those bodies, seen those empty bunks. The walls of the aircraft are thin enough that you could force a pen through them with your bare hands, and the whole aircraft smells of petrol, hot oil, cordite, metal and piss. Up here in this rattling, shaking, stinking, thin-skinned tin can, the air is far too thin to breathe. If the oxygen fails, if the mask gets frozen with spit or sweat or vomit or blood, you'll pass out. And if you do and no one finds you, then within a few minutes you'll die. Over the target, the fighters and the flak will come. Every young man knows that the flak comes from below, so you try and sit on some armour plates, willing to lose a leg or a foot or a hand, but not your manhood. Everyone is tense up here, concentrating, trying to stay alive. You know that if you get home tonight, then tomorrow they will order you to do it again. And again, and again, until your turn comes up. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, and today I'm going to talk to you about fear, failure, and flying for one of the strategic bomber forces in World War II. This style of video is a little different from my normal fare because the subject is a little different from my normal fare, but I hope that you will bear with me and enjoy it nonetheless. We're going to explore the complicated relationship between military discipline, mental health, and courage. In 1914, Britain had entered the First World War with a very Victorian notion that shooting a man for cowardice was perfectly acceptable and normal, but as the war progressed, it began to realise that, in an age of mechanised industrial warfare, the line between psychological breakdown and cowardice was, at best, unclear. Nonetheless, there was fear amongst the officers of the British Army that the rabble that they'd recruited to fight might at any moment break and run, seeing as how they were from the lower orders and obviously needed strong handling. Hence they maintained the discipline of holding a courts-martial and potentially shooting someone. However, as draconian as that sounds, it is perhaps worth noting that of the approximately 3,000 death sentences handed down by courts-martial between 1914 and 18, only 323 were ever carried out, almost 90% of them prior to 1917. The protracted struggles on the Somme, at Arras, on Vimy Ridge, at Passchendaele had finally brought the BEF High Command to the understanding that even apparently strong and stable men might break down, and indeed that breeding and background had almost no bearing on who became a victim of what they called shell shock. In his seminal work on the subject, Anatomy of Courage, based on research done in the First World War, Lord Moran, who later went on to become Winston Churchill's personal doctor, wrote, "Courage is willpower, whereof no man has an unlimited stock, and when in war it is used up, he is finished. A man's courage is his capital, and he is always spending." Moran's work, even today, is considered a pretty good model of how combat affects fighting troops, pointing out that even the very brave can only take so much time at the front line. But it is indicative of attitudes towards psychological damage, manliness and cowardice post-war, which in fact lasted well into the 20th century, that the work wasn't actually published until 1967. By 1939, unlike the Americans, the British had banned the practice of shooting cowards, and there was concern about how discipline could be maintained in combat situations. It wasn't that commanders didn't know psychological casualties were possible, but they saw the problem as a collective one of discipline, a sort of virus which might break out if a man failed to perform his duties, and then in turn might infect others and lead to a complete breakdown in the chain of command. Therefore, whilst disciplining a man who was shell-shocked was hard on that man, it was for the collective good. And this was fine for a small professional air force pre-war, but how to cope with the mass influx of civilians? Indeed, how to cope with 30% of your force coming from Australia, Canada, Ireland, South Africa, and even the United States and beyond? They had very different cultures and backgrounds and ideas of manliness, but they needed to be integrated into the RAF command. How to keep discipline, but allow for the realities of combat fatigue? The answer that the RAF came up with in 1940 was a fudge, a semi-medical sounding and highly judgmental term, lack of moral fibre, or LMF. It was deliberately never properly defined, either as a medical condition or indeed as a disciplinary one, but amorphously phrased as having lost the commanding officer's confidence in their ability to carry out their duties in the face of danger. Whilst they could in theory still shoot their own men, the United States Army Air Forces faced a very similar problem, a massive explosion in their size almost overnight. They were extremely reluctant to use that ultimate sanction. In 1941, they had had about 350,000 men enlisted, all of whom were volunteers, almost all in the United States. Then, of course, came Roosevelt's Gate Drive and the Selective Service System, which effectively ended volunteering but massively increased conscription. And by the end of 1943, the USAAF had 2.4 million men on the books, a lot of them in combat roles, a lot of them based overseas. The Army Air Forces went to great lengths to try and get people into their ranks who they thought would have the right stuff. Psychological assessments, discussions around preferences, technical aptitude, personal aptitude, all were tested extensively, but at the end of the day, they were dealing with conscripts, some of whom would have rather been literally anywhere else on Earth than where they were now. Added to that, US crews in Europe in particular were flying in what most people considered to be somebody else's war, thousands of miles from home, often whilst they sustained catastrophic losses, especially in late 1943 and early 1944, and often being ordered to go back again and again to the same targets. Little wonder morale was a problem in some outfits, and some commanders court-martialed first and asked questions later. As a general rule, the US didn't have a term like LMF, but rather talked about combat stress, seeing it as something which a man might overcome if he could get some rest. Whilst this sounds better, the USAAF was just as prejudiced against men who refused to do their duty and were seen as yellow or shirkers, while everybody else was out there risking their necks to get the job done. And typically, officers saw refusal to fly, say, as not a mental problem, but a disciplinary one. Consequently, psychiatrists' reports were just as easily ignored or indeed bypassed. And it's not as if the fears of the flyers were unjustified or somehow difficult to understand. There were peculiar threats that the men faced in bombers, depending on the tactics that had been chosen by their commanders. For the RAF flyers, for example, it was the night itself which held the terror. Surrounded by thousands of other unseen aircraft, they saw bright burning petals of flame when a bomber went down, and they told one another stories about how the Germans had shells called chrysanthemums, which were supposed to scare them by exploding just as if they'd seen a bomber explode. Of course, what they were seeing was indeed their comrades' aircrafts detonating in the darkness. Night fighters stalked unseen and unheard until the last moment, like monsters emerging from the deep to snatch life and limb away. Death and horror came from nowhere, out of the inky black, from absolute calm to absolute terror with no warning. At best, you might hear a gunner screaming, "Corkscrew right," over the intercom, engines screaming in a sickening, howling, lurching, ear-popping, vomit-inducing rollercoaster ride as a pilot attempted to shake an unseen assailant by throwing the huge four-engine monster across the sky, hoping that the machine didn't break up or strike another bomber in the dark. At worst, there was a sudden disintegration of metal and flesh into a fiery mist as cannon shells came from nowhere to tear men and aircraft apart, followed by a long, terrifying, limping flight back to safety, constantly waiting for the next attack to come, trying to keep crewmen and aircraft alive. For US flyers, the terror was seen. It was seen everywhere for miles. The tension of scanning for attacks, the flak, the fighters roaring in, the gunners firing in a vain attempt to try and protect themselves and their crews, the aircraft just like yours breaking up, tumbling downward, spraying metal and men across the sky, the prayers for 10 chutes to come out, the fires which you could see. And then, of course, at the other end, the landings and the men being called out of the aircraft, the blood, the mutilation, the death on the runway. And then there were things that were common to both the United States and RAF flyers. The extreme heights, the realisation that there was absolutely nothing between you and the ground for literally miles straight down, and that you were flying an aircraft which, even without enemy action, was incredibly dangerous. The vertigo and the fear, even before the enemy got involved, was not helped by all the crap you had to wear just to survive the freezing cold temperatures at 20,000 feet. It meant even basic movement was next to impossible. I mean, how the hell did you get out of this bucket of bolts if it started to fall apart? How do you treat a man who's been half blown apart at 25,000 feet, who won't stop screaming, is dying of hypoxia, and you can't touch any metal surface without freezing to it? The knowledge that if your plane was hit by flak, the shrapnel was likely to be going up and could unman you in an instant was a particularly cruel and pernicious fear for young men, and a fear which was far from baseless. The completely random nature of who bought it and who didn't. And then you get back to the empty beds and the cleared lockers and the missing spaces and the replacements and the endless cycle of a bomber base. Infantrymen who had to live in the rain and the snow and the mud and the shit for weeks at a time generally fought one action and had a rest, but not so the bomber boys. They got clean sheets and showers and hot food, and although some of them had to sleep in freezing tents and seas of mud, there was a whiplash between the combat zone and that home life, which was repeated again and again and again, because unlike the infantry, there was no pause between battles. As Harris put it, we fought a major action every single day with the vast majority of our forces. Almost every single man who flew was afraid at some level. Some said it was worse before they flew, some when they were in the air. Many tried to front it out and pretend that they were fine, only to cry themselves to sleep at night. Some were genuinely unafraid at the time, but then spent years reliving missions once they were back home. Those who were able to shut down their imaginations and simply focus on the task at hand generally did better than those with more vivid imaginations. Terms like flak happy got used to describe the mental exhaustion and desperation amongst crews who were often operating when dead tired for days or nights at a time, flying 6, 7, 8, 9-hour missions, which became daily or nightly events despite both forces trying not to make crews fly back to back. It happened regularly, and that meant operating on maybe 4 or 5 hours sleep before going on to the next op. Amphetamines and downers became coping mechanisms for many. The bald statistics lay bare the reality of these imagined risks. Losses did vary during the war, and they varied across units, and some of them were extreme. As an example, 101 Squadron in Bomber Command, which specialised in ECM or electronic countermeasure work, suffered 1,094 crewmen killed and 178 captured, along with 171 aircraft destroyed. And this came from a strength at any given moment of 18 aircraft and 146 men. Put it a different way, 101 was wiped out 11 times over. This is, as I say, extreme. However, overall, the chances of finishing your tour were about 1 in 4 for both US and RAF crews. If they made it to 25 missions, US crews were rotated home, but could volunteer to go again. Bomber Command crews, after 35 missions, were required to take a break of 6 months before being expected to fly a second tour of 20 missions. 90% of them died on that second tour. It's understandable why there was near mutiny when decisions were made to, say, only credit crews with half a mission when they flew to France, which is what the USAAF did briefly, or when the British crews were told that at any mission to northern France, the Low Countries only counted for a third of an op, as they were between 1943 and 44. On average, throughout the war, Bomber Command lost 20,000 dead, wounded or captured every year, about 55 people a day. Death or mutilation was not imaginary, or indeed unlikely. It was a question of when, not if, and the men knew it. The men who flew were, certainly for somebody of my relatively advanced years, terrifyingly young, averaging between 18 and 23, but there were plenty of men who'd lied and actually wound up flying at 17. And they were thrown together as crews from across the world or across the US and sent into combat to places that most of them had never heard of for pretty uncertain results. To me, it's hardly surprising some men refuse to fly anymore. And reading about the realities of what they faced brings it home. Men who were blown out of the aircraft and had to be hauled back in by their crew. Men who saw friends die horrifically in the air or were badly wounded, recovered and then expected to return to the line. One of the more horrific stories I came across was the official medical report concerning a young RAF flight engineer who'd done 20 operations and had 150 combat hours, being put up in front of a board to determine whether or not he was a coward after refusing to fly. And I quote, "He had been badly shot up on 4 occasions. On the last of these, after being attacked by a night fighter, the port engine of his machine caught fire. The upper gunner was badly injured and the rear gunner was killed. The rear gunner's body was burning and motionless in the turret. To prevent the aircraft from being consumed by the flames, he had to use a fire axe to hack bits off the blazing turret and also parts of the rear gunner's clothing and body, finally letting the slipstream blow them away. The wireless, the hydraulics and the tyres had all been shot away and the aircraft crash-landed. 10 days later, the officer was found in a nervous state with tremulous hands and sweaty palms. He had headaches, he felt unable to relax, he was depressed, preoccupied and unable to concentrate. His appetite was bad. When I asked him how he would sum up his feelings in a word, he said, fear. The board in that instance gave him a spell of non-operational duty rather than assuming cowardice, but others were not so lucky. Different commanders and different bases at different times all had different approaches to LMF. Unlike the British Army, who actually had pretty good battlefield-ready psychiatry available close to the front, the RAF officially displayed a weird reluctance to address the problem head-on. Unofficially, it was widely recognised that a man who'd been trained to fly was a valuable asset, so the object was to try and keep him flying as long as possible, and taking a man out because he'd done something stupid or just acted out or reached the end of his tether but might recover was self-defeating. Most decent COs would quietly deal with the problem with a transfer or a period of rest. If it went further and a man was declared to be LMF, he would be examined by an RAF psychologist who would then submit a report to the CO, which was often enough to get some form of clemency, although the CO was not obliged to consider the report at all, which could lead to a deeply inconsistent set of results for the same kind of problems. Statistics for LMF cases and courts-martial are really hard to come by. The RAF studies didn't really happen until the 1980s and 90s, and in the USAAF the problem was very much swept under the carpet at the time, and although some post-war statistics were collected, many were destroyed, lost, classified or buried. What we do know is that of the 1.1 million British and Commonwealth personnel who served in the RAF, just 8,402 were referred for neurosis between 1942 and 1945, with just 2,762 declared LMF. About 34% of them were pilots, about 30% of them were from Bomber Command. Put it a different way, that's about 20 men a month from Bomber Command. United States Army Air Force statistics, such as they were compiled in 1945 and showed a remarkably low number of 2,100 who were permanently grounded for psychological reasons, roughly 1% of those who flew for the 8th Air Force. But as I say, the records are patchy and these figures don't include men who were convicted or suspended for cowardice, as it was seen by their COs, nor men who were convicted under courts-martial for something else, like, striking an officer, which was actually a form of mental breakdown. In all probability, both figures reflect the stigma and inflexibility of the system much more than they reflect anything close to the extent of the mental damage done to those who served. The term LMF struck fear into the hearts of all RAF personnel for the entire war. The rumour went that someone who was found to be LMF would be paraded out in front of the entire station, have their rank badges ritually torn off their uniforms, and then be marched off to do hard labour, or worse. Although pervasive and persistent, this was just that, a rumour. Those marked LMF formally were simply shipped off the base overnight with the minimum of fuss, and most stories end with, "and we never saw him again." One pilot observed that his engineer had gone mad on a flight over Germany and had to be knocked out using a metal bar. He disappeared off the base the next day, and the next time he saw this man's name, it was as part of 617 Squadron on the Dams raid. Men could be, and were, rehabilitated under the counter. That doesn't mean that being declared LMF wouldn't and couldn't have serious, long-lasting consequences. A man's file was marked with a red W for waverer. NCOs were stripped of their rank and officers were required to resign their commissions. Both would be put on menial duties on the ground. Those with pilot training were stripped of their qualifications and, wherever possible, barred from getting a private pilot's licence so that they couldn't seek private work as a flyer, even post-war. In some cases, they were dispatched to the aircrew refresher centres for a few weeks. These were institutions a bit like a kind of reform school for RAF personnel. They do drill and PT and attend lectures before either returning to operations or being discharged dishonourably. From 1944, men who were sent to the aircrew refresher stations who didn't go back to their units would be posted to the infantry or conscripted into the coal mines. Only in very, very rare cases were men charged with courts-martial and penal labour. Aircrew branded as LMF faced a lifetime of recrimination, and many found employment after the war difficult. There was huge stigma attached to being branded LMF in the first place, which effectively erased them out of RAF history. It's perhaps telling that in neither the official history of the bomber campaign, nor in Harris's memoirs, nor in Portal's memoirs does the term LMF feature even once, and indeed even in modern histories of the RAF, they often fail to mention the subject entirely. It wasn't until 1984 that any study was available publicly. US flyers who refused to fly were more likely to be looked on as suffering from combat stress rather than shirking, but nonetheless convictions did happen, and in reality a system similar to the RAF's emerged where individuals could lose the confidence of their CO and might be treated similarly, with a loss of rank and rotation back to the United States to perform menial tasks and in rare cases imprisonment. That said, the United States system was more advanced and more forward-thinking, and it did have some mechanisms to try and head off combat stress at the start, and this system began to be kind of adopted in places by the RAF too. The first person to spot combat stress in US crews was typically the flight surgeon. Their job was not so much the treatment of the man and making them psychologically sound, as getting them back into their aircraft to complete their tour of duty, whatever the price. Flight surgeons could recommend that a man be grounded, but he didn't have any power to enforce it, and as COs wanted every man flying all the time, often this meant pills. Pills to get up, pills to go to sleep, pills to keep going, pills to deal with the symptoms of the pills, and so on and so on and so on. From the moment that the 8th Air Force arrived in the United Kingdom in 1942, a small team of 18 highly trained research psychologists established something called the Central Medical Establishment, or CME, as a research project to help airmen to stay on the front lines in a multitude of quite surprising ways. Their focus was, like flight surgeons, to try and get them back into the state where they could fly, but they framed it as taking care of the flyer, rather than the more brutal squadron level, get them in the air. They had a remarkably wide remit, so they got themselves involved in, things like air-sea rescue services, which gave the crews confidence that if they went down in the sea, they would be picked up, and therefore took the edge off some of that fear of flying over water. They got involved in pioneering clothing to make sure that it was warm enough, that it worked properly. They helped to improve equipment around the aircraft, again, just helping the airmen feel like they were being taken care of. And of course, they got involved in the psychological treatment of flyers suffering from combat stress. They categorised aircrew who were referred to them into two broad categories: flying fatigue, which was seen as a form of mild stress caused by combat, and operational fatigue, which was more deep-seated and required long-term treatment. However, CME recommendations were just that. They were still recommendations, and airmen put in front of a CO for apparent cowardice were in the lap of the gods as much as their British counterparts. Sometimes the CO listened to the CME reports, sometimes they convicted the flyer of dereliction of duty. In the US and latterly in the RAF, rest and recuperation stations were established to allow aircrew some downtime in a safe and controlled space, typically as a crew. Both forces experimented with induced sleep, so-called narcosis therapy, administering drugs to let an individual sleep for a few days at a time, and thus it was hoped would allow exhausted crew to refill their well of courage. And the results initially looked very promising, with 70% of those that were treated this way returning to the front lines. But further studies looking at how those individuals survived long term showed that just 13% made it past 4 missions, and the therapy was stopped in mid-1944. Initially in North Africa and then in Italy, USAAF psychologists began to pioneer dissociative treatment by administering something called sodium pentanol. That's the so-called truth serum. What they would do is then let the flyer talk through what happened. Psychologists would probe the experience of the men, recreating flak, machine guns and so on, in minute detail. Men would shake, vomit, wet themselves, scream, walk about as if they were in the aircraft, and use pillows and sheets as if they were armour. Although forward-thinking, because dissociative treatment is now considered as an important tool in treating PTSD, these early and clumsy attempts generally did far more harm than good, re-traumatising again and again the men that went through it. For all these attempts, well-meaning and otherwise, I'm struck at the thought about how so many men went through and never broke in public. They never disobeyed an order. They did their duty in that war, and then they went home full of the scars which didn't show on the surface. The fear of fighting for them was less than the fear of letting down their buddies, of endangering their aircraft, or of the social shame that would come with being marked in some way as being unmanly. Each man who flew fought his own private, personal war in his head. Most would fight those mental battles for the rest of their lives. Like their brothers and sisters in other services, and indeed like civilians that they bombed, they became parents and teachers and policemen and lawyers and library clerks and every other imaginable job, and carried their trauma and their anger and their memories and their violence with them. And by and large, they didn't talk about it. My parents' generation was born right at the end of the war, or just after. They were raised by parents and schooled by teachers, suffering from post-traumatic stress on an industrial scale. That trauma was in turn transmitted to a goodly number of my generation too, in the violence, in the drinking, in the inability to communicate, and the things which happened behind closed doors of apparently happy houses. And on that happy note, we will leave things today. The lesson, if there is one, is perhaps that whilst there's a lot wrong with the world today, we can and should talk to one another about what's going on in our own heads. We might all be alone at some level, but we have that in common with one another. Have a cup of tea with a mate, have a real talk, have a proper talk. Go and see a therapist. Seek a diagnosis. If you're prescribed medication, take it. There is no sense in trying to walk on with a broken leg without using a crutch, and the world will be a better place for it. Peace and love. Hardthrasher out.